Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown and Vicar's wife never left church, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. She entered church, never left. The church bell rang once, and in that single chime, something ancient and unspeakable awoke beneath the floorboards of St. Hecate's Chapel. It was Sunday morning when Eleanor Wentworth stepped through the iron gate, her gloved hand brushing against the rusted hinges like a whisper of silk over bone. She was the vicar's wife, beloved, composed, always on time, always in her pew. Third row from the front, right-hand side, next to the stained glass window of St. Margaret holding a lamb. She entered the church exactly at 9:28 a.m. 10 parishioners saw her arrive. No one saw her leave. By 11, she had vanished. Gone, without a single soul hearing the door open, without the slightest scuff of a heel on the stone floor, without the breeze of movement past the wooden aisle. The hymn ended. The vicar raised his hand to bless the bread, but the seat beside the window, her seat, was empty. At first, there was only confusion. The vicar, trembling slightly, assumed Eleanor had stepped out for water, but there was no sound from the vestibule, no echo of footsteps. The wooden door, heavy and swollen with age, made no noise. It hadn't opened, and no one had seen her go. Not the elderly Mrs. Fallon, who sat 2 pews behind. Not the boy who held the offertory tray, not the blind organist with perfect ears, not even Father Brown. He had been there, quietly, behind a pillar, as he often sat when not giving sermon, observing, listening, letting the weight of the place press into his soul. He had noticed Eleanor's entrance, the small tilt of her head as she passed by the statue of the Madonna, as if acknowledging something unseen. He saw her sit, place her gloves delicately on the bench. But he never saw her rise again. It was the kind of disappearance that shouldn't have been possible. Not in a stone church sealed on all sides, with only one entrance, under the eyes of nearly 30 people. The police searched the vestry, the cellar, the bell tower. No trace. Her purse remained untouched beneath the pew. A prayer book marked with a ribbon still open to Psalm 23. One glove had fallen, still warm to the touch. By dusk, the whispers had begun. Had Eleanor fled? Was it madness? A lover? Something darker? But Father Brown did not speak. He sat alone in the cold church, long after the police had gone, fingers laced, eyes closed, lips barely moving. He was thinking, not praying. The next morning, the altar was found overturned. The heavy wooden slab, which hadn't been moved in 100 years, now lay tilted, exposing the old stone beneath it. Damp, uneven, covered in ancient scratches, like claw marks, made by a creature that had never seen light. The candles had burned low, the wax pooling unnaturally in straight lines, like symbols perhaps, or warnings. Father Brown said nothing of this, at least not to the police. But he noticed what no one else did. A faint line of soot, smudged along the eastern wall, just beneath the shadow of the crucifix. Not from a candle, and not from fire. It was, he thought, the residue of something leaving, not entering. That night, Father Brown returned alone. The wind outside howled, but inside the church it was colder. stiller, like time had paused to listen. He walked slowly to the pew where Eleanor had sat. The cushion was untouched, the prayer book still open, but something was off. He closed his eyes. There was a scent, a faint sweetness, something floral and warm. Honeysuckle, Eleanor had worn it. But there was also something else now. Beneath it, old water, damp stone, and something bitter, metallic, like rust or blood. Suddenly, a creak echoed above him. The bell tower. He climbed it, step by cautious step, his cassock brushing the stone. At the top, the bell hung still, silent. Yet beside it, where no one had stood for years, lay a single object, Eleanor's second glove, folded, delicately placed, as if set down with reverence. That was when he noticed the dust. Everywhere in the church, dust settled thick with age. But not here, not beneath the bell. There, the stone was clean, swept in a perfect circle. Not a footprint, not a mark. Just the absence of dust. The presence of nothing. And nothing, Father Brown knew, was more terrifying than silence that had been prepared. The next day, whispers turned to fear. A child, Elsie Drew, claimed to have seen a woman in white behind the altar at night. The baker's son refused to enter the chapel, crying about a shadow that moved without sound. And the vicar, Eleanor's husband, was not seen for 2 days. When Father Brown finally found him, it was in the crypt beneath the church. The vicar was staring at the old bones, stacked neatly in the ossuary, whispering names under his breath. Names that didn't match the dead. Names no one recognized. His hands were scraped. His eyes wide, red, terrified. In his pocket was a letter, half-burnt, addressed to Eleanor. Father Brown read what remained. "Forgive me. It was meant to stop with me, but I fear it's begun again. The door never stays shut. If you hear them, do not answer. If they call you, do not speak. And whatever you do, Eleanor, please, do not go near the altar during the hymn." She had gone near the altar. Father Brown returned to the church, alone again. He stood where she had vanished. And then, for reasons even he could not explain, he hummed the hymn that had played that morning. The floor groaned, the stained glass shivered, and something beneath his feet moved. Not a tremor, not a draft, a shift, as though the earth had breathed, as though something buried long ago had stirred again. He did not flinch. Instead, he turned his eyes to the crucifix and whispered a name, not Eleanor's, a different one, a name he had read once in a burned page of an old church record, a name associated with a woman who had also vanished a century earlier in that same pew. The record had been smudged, but he had pieced it together. Margaret Halcombe, 1871, gone during the hymn, no trace. The same pew, the same perfume, the same disappearance. Was it coincidence? A pattern? A ritual? Father Brown did not believe in coincidence, but then the church bell rang. Once, no wind, no hand to pull it. And on the pew, where Eleanor had vanished, sat a letter, sealed with wax, unmarked, but inside, written in fine, looping script. "You're asking the wrong questions. She never left, and neither did I." There was no signature, and there was no explanation. Father Brown stared at the words, then back at the empty space beside the stained glass window. He did not move, not even when the candle beside him flickered, though there was no draught, not even when the bell rang again, not even when, behind him, he heard the slow creak of the wooden door he had locked himself. And when the church warden arrived the next morning, the doors were still locked. No one had entered, but on the altar, laid perfectly parallel with the Book of Common Prayer, were 2 gloves, folded, one black, one white. And Father Brown, he was not in the church, nor outside it. But sometime later, when asked what had happened to Eleanor, he only said, "I know who called her, but I dare not speak their name, because in places like these, names wake things." Then he smiled sadly, and never entered St. Hecate's again, not even when the bell rang for the third time, alone, at midnight. And no one could explain why. Chapter 2. Father Brown saw her first. She was already dead when Father Brown saw her walk into the church. It wasn't a trick of the light, it wasn't imagination, nor was it one of those moments people later chalk up to fatigue or shadows. No. Father Brown, with all his quiet and unsettling certainty, saw Eleanor Wentworth walk across the stone floor of St. Hecate's Church the morning after her disappearance, and her shoes did not make a sound. She walked past him like a breath through a dying flame, elegant, pale, wearing the same cream coat and feathered hat she had worn the day before. But something had changed. Her face was different, not twisted, not monstrous, just emptied, as if every emotion had been removed and only the shape of her remained. Her eyes passed over Father Brown, and he felt it. Not recognition, not awareness, but something colder, as if her soul had forgotten him, and the body simply kept moving. She didn't speak. She crossed the nave, reached the third pew on the right, and sat down in silence. Then, just as quickly, she was gone, not vanished in a puff or flash, simply absent. One blink, and the space was empty again. But the faint scent of honeysuckle still lingered. Father Brown never told anyone that he saw her first, because he was afraid that meant he would see her last. By mid-morning, the church was full of murmurs. A search party combed the nearby woods. The vicar, pale and shaking, begged the constable to keep the press away. But the worst was not the hysteria or the speculation. It was the church itself. It had changed. There was something wrong with the acoustics. Words echoed longer than they should. Footsteps no longer matched the sound they made. Light through the stained glass bent strangely across the altar. A mirror had been placed in the confession box. No one admitted to putting it there, and twice the organ had played 3 dissonant notes, by itself. Father Brown waited, not in fear, but in stillness. That evening, he went to Eleanor's cottage. It was untouched. The kitchen was clean, the fire burned low, and the parlor smelled of lavender oil and old hymn books. But above the fireplace, framed between 2 antique candle holders, hung a portrait of Eleanor. She wasn't smiling in it. Her expression was distant. Her eyes were looking slightly to the right. But what chilled Father Brown was not her face. It was the fact that in the reflection of the painted window behind her, there was a second face, half hidden, watching her. He stepped closer. It wasn't an artist's mistake. It wasn't a trick of paint. It was deliberate. The shadow behind the glass had no eyes, just a wide, pale mouth, open, waiting. He left the house without touching anything, but as he shut the door, he saw that someone had written something in the frost on the inside of the glass pane. 2 words, traced with a finger. You knew. Back at the vicarage, the Reverend refused to speak. He sat in the dark, clutching a candle, even in daylight. When Father Brown entered, the vicar flinched, like a man struck. His voice trembled when he said, "Did she say anything?" Father Brown didn't answer. "I told her not to look," the vicar whispered. "I told her never to look through that door." "What door?" Father Brown asked. The vicar pointed behind him, to the hallway, but there was no door, just wallpaper. A smooth stretch of pale rose pattern, with no handles, no frames, no seams. Except, Father Brown noticed, the wallpaper ended just an inch too early. A faint line, a forgotten outline, a door that had been sealed. He stepped forward and placed his palm against it. It was warm. That night, something changed in the village. Dogs howled, clocks stopped at 2:13 a.m., and several parishioners reported dreams where Eleanor stood at the altar, weeping blood onto the prayer book. Father Brown didn't sleep. Instead, he returned to the church once more. It was 3 in the morning. The bell tower cast a long shadow across the cemetery, but the church itself was lit, dimly, unnaturally, as if the stained glass windows glowed from within. He stepped inside. There, in the center aisle, stood Eleanor. This time, she looked at him, but not like a woman, like a witness. Her lips didn't move, but her voice filled the air, soft, melodic, impossible to place. She said, "You saw me first, and you said nothing." Father Brown's voice cracked. "I saw you because I was meant to." She walked backward, never turning toward the altar. As she did, the candles along the walls lit one by one. The old floorboards moaned like they were remembering something. The air thickened. Then she stopped, 1 foot from the altar. "I wasn't the first," she said. Father Brown nodded. "I know." "You're not ready to know the second," she whispered, and with that, she faded. Not in smoke, not in light, but like a memory that was never yours to begin with. The next day, the local constable discovered something new. Beneath the altar, behind the cracked stone where the base had been disturbed, lay a shallow cavity. Inside, it was a box, a child's coffin. Too small, too old. No name, but carved along the side were 3 letters, scratched crudely into the wood. E.W.W. Eleanor Wentworth's initials. But the wood was 100 years old. The carbon dating would later confirm it. It made no sense. It couldn't make sense. Unless Eleanor had never been born. Unless she had been buried first. Father Brown stood over the coffin as it was unearthed. He stared at the initials, then at the pale face of the vicar, who trembled and clutched a rosary so tightly the beads broke. The vicar muttered something then. "She asked me if the church kept secrets," he said. Father Brown didn't respond. "She asked me," the vicar continued, "what happens when you pray in the wrong direction." That night, the painting in Eleanor's house was gone. In its place, scorched into the wall, was a new image, burnt in smoke and ash, as if drawn by fire itself. A girl in white, her mouth open, her hands raised, and behind her, a shadow with no face, just a mass of lines where eyes should have been. Watching. Father Brown closed the door gently behind him. He returned to the church, took one long look at the altar, and then did something no one expected. He knelt, and for the first time in his life, he whispered, "I don't want to understand." But understanding had already begun. The next morning, a letter arrived. No stamp, no handwriting, just a folded sheet of music. A hymn, unnumbered, with no lyrics, only the title. She Walked Alone Before Dawn. At the bottom, in Father Brown's own handwriting, though he had no memory of writing it, were 4 words. I saw her first. Chapter 3. The candle was still warm. The corpse was ice cold, but the candle at her bedside was still warm to the touch. It was a detail so small, so irrelevant on first glance, that even the attending constable nearly dismissed it. But Father Brown's fingers paused just a second longer on the coppery wax stub, still slightly malleable, still radiating a faint heat. As if someone had been there moments before they arrived, watching her die, or worse, staying long after. Eleanor's body lay perfectly composed on the guest room bed inside the old rectory, her arms folded, her eyes closed, not in fear, not in peace, but in refusal, as though she had simply rejected reality and stepped out of it. No struggle, no blood, no signs of entry or exit. A window sealed, a door bolted from within. She had not left the house, the priest swore, and no one had entered. The room was locked. The room was empty. And yet the candle was still warm. Father Brown did not ask about poisons or heart attacks. He did not fumble for fingerprints or footprints. He stood by the door, his shadow stretching into the hallway, and let the silence of the house speak first. He had seen it before, the look on Eleanor's face, not fear, not surrender. Something more terrible. Knowledge. A deep, bone-sick awareness that whatever she had realized in her final moments was something she could not share, or wouldn't, or was forbidden to. The vicar, her husband, had not cried. He was pale, silent, mechanical. When asked when he last saw her, he only muttered, "After the hymn, before the bell." He didn't elaborate. Father Brown stepped into the hallway, then into the small study across the corridor. The candle on Eleanor's table. Why was it lit in the middle of the day? The sun had still been out when she died. Who lights a candle when the curtains are open? He glanced at the floorboards, 2 sets of indentations, one beneath the bed, where a second pair of feet had stood for some time, long enough to warp the grain of the wood slightly, long enough to mean they weren't there to leave quickly. Then, in the waste bin, a torn envelope. The crest was faded but familiar, the same seal that had once been used for funerals at St. Hecate's 2 decades earlier. It was black, with a silver ink crescent moon. The letter inside was missing, but a sliver of parchment remained, torn, singed at the edges. Only one sentence was legible. "If the candle burns warm, the soul has not yet left the room." Father Brown did not blink. That night, he stayed inside the church, after everyone else had gone. It was darker than usual. The air had a weight to it, like thick velvet soaked in rain. And when the wind blew, it did not howl, it whispered. He approached the altar. There, beneath the cross, lay a new candle, not the church's. It was identical to Eleanor's. He touched it. It was warm, but no one had entered, and no one had died. Not yet. Father Brown closed his eyes. Something was replaying, an echo. He didn't believe in ghosts, not the way others did, but he knew about memory and grief and places that remembered pain too clearly to forget. The church had seen death before, but this time it wasn't mourning, it was waiting. Later, at the library archives, he asked for funeral records matching the seal on the envelope. Only one fit. Elizabeth Wentworth, buried 20 years ago. Sister of the vicar, declared dead after a 3-day illness, age 23. But her cause of death was left blank, and her funeral, according to the records, was held at a private hour, with no guests and no body. Father Brown's pen stopped mid-note. He returned to the vicarage. The vicar wasn't there, but the study light was on. On the desk, a book lay open. Old leather, cracked spine, handwritten in Latin. It was a liturgical text, but not a Catholic one. Something older, more esoteric. Rituals to keep the soul bound to a space. Candles, recitations, symbols, and a phrase circled in red ink. One must never extinguish the candle until the truth is accepted. The candle. He ran to Eleanor's room. The candle on the nightstand was gone. In its place was a trail of wax droplets leading to the church. He followed. It was past midnight. The wind had died. The path to the church felt longer than it should have, like the distance was stretching with each step. But eventually, he reached the great oak doors. They were ajar. Inside, every pew was empty, but the altar glowed, and behind it, facing the other way, stood Eleanor, not pale, not dead, not alive. She didn't speak when he stepped forward. She only lifted one hand, and in it held the warm candle, burning. No smoke. Then she whispered, "It was never about who lit it. It was about who refused to blow it out." Father Brown's voice shook. Why? Because they feared what they'd see in the dark. The flames flickered blue, and for one moment, just one, he saw the truth. The altar was not made of stone, not anymore. It was a door, or a lid, or a tomb, and beneath it, something moved, a shape, long buried, bound, still breathing. Then the candle snuffed itself out. No wind, just silence. Eleanor was gone again, and Father Brown, standing alone in the now pitch-black church, whispered to himself, "She didn't die in that room. She was returned to it." By morning, the candle was found at the edge of the altar, cold, but the wick was unburned, and Eleanor's body, still in the bed, eyes closed. But the expression had changed. She was smiling now, and in her closed fist, clenched so tightly it took the doctor 5 minutes to pry open, was a match, unused, unlit. Father Brown turned away. He would not ask who gave it to her, or why. Some mysteries are not solved. They are only endured, and as he stepped outside, he muttered a phrase no one heard clearly. But the closest approximation was, "I know who struck the match, but I cannot say what they lit." Chapter 4. Blood where the Bible was. There was blood where the Bible had been, and no one, not even Father Brown, could say when it appeared. It was the first Sunday after Eleanor's burial. The congregation came, hollow-eyed and trembling, more out of obligation than faith. The church had begun to feel wrong in ways no one could articulate, an undercurrent, a dissonance, a feeling that time bent differently once you crossed the threshold. But the faithful sat in their pews. They bowed their heads. And as the organist began to play the first hymn, Father Brown approached the pulpit and stopped cold. The Bible, the same one that had been opened to Psalm 23 for decades, bound in heavy leather and brass corners, the one that never left its place, was gone. In its place was a thick, dark smear. Blood, not dried, not old, fresh, still warm. It had pooled gently on the carved wooden stand. No spray, no violence, no object to explain its presence. Just that single, horrific detail. The Bible was missing, and in its place was blood. Not a single congregant saw anyone touch it. No footsteps, no noise. Just Father Brown's still form at the front, frozen in disbelief. The organ halted. Silence dropped like a curtain. He didn't say a word. He simply stepped down, walked out of the church, and locked the doors behind him. No one questioned it. Later, as the sky darkened and the wind picked up, the vicar arrived at the rectory, face pale, sweat dampening the collar of his shirt. In his hand, wrapped in linen, was the Bible. He placed it on the rectory table in front of Father Brown, but said nothing, because he couldn't. His mouth wouldn't open. His lips trembled. His teeth clenched shut, like something inside him knew better than to let words out. Father Brown unwrapped the Bible. The leather binding was untouched, the pages unwarped, no blood, no marks, nothing. He flipped to Psalm 23. Every word had been scratched out with a fine blade, not torn, surgically removed as though verse by verse had been cut from the world, erased with intention. But only that psalm. The rest of the book was intact. Father Brown looked up slowly. The vicar was crying now, silently, the tears slipping down his cheeks as if his body had remembered how to grieve, but his soul hadn't caught up. He raised his hands to speak, and finally he managed to whisper one thing. "It wasn't me." Father Brown believed him, but that made things worse. That night thunder cracked above St. Hecate's, but the rain never came. The sky flickered, but there was no lightning, just light, brief, unnatural, like the heavens blinked. And in that blink, Father Brown walked back into the church alone. The blood had vanished, but a single page, torn from the Bible, lay folded on the pulpit. One side was blank, the other side had a message, scrawled in faded ink, jagged, unsure handwriting. The blood was never hers, it was ours. From the first time we read it wrong. Father Brown didn't sleep. He sat in the chapel until dawn, fingers folded, eyes fixed on the pulpit. He did not pray. He listened. The next morning, news came. 3 villagers reported dreams that night, identical dreams. In them, they stood in the church, completely alone. The pews were empty, the windows blacked out, and in every dream, the Bible bled. Not metaphorically. It pulsed, it throbbed, it dripped onto the floor, seeping between the stones like oil through cloth. When they reached to touch it, a voice, faint, feminine, whispered, "You were warned not to speak what you do not understand." And then they woke, all at 3:13 a.m. Father Brown walked the cemetery that afternoon. He passed by Eleanor's grave, but paused at another, a weathered, forgotten stone near the back wall, covered in moss. The name was almost gone, but he knew it by heart. Margaret Halcombe, died 1871, the same name that had appeared in a half-burned church ledger weeks ago. The same woman who disappeared in the 3rd pew from the front, the one now sealed off with velvet rope. He bent down. Something shimmered at the base of the stone. A scrap of cloth. White, but not aged. Fresh, new. He touched it, still damp. He sniffed it. Blood. Not rust, not paint. Recent. Father Brown stood slowly, and then behind him he heard a sound that made his breath freeze in his lungs. A page turning. He turned. There was no one there. But behind the stone, between 2 roots, lay the Bible. The same one. Still wrapped, still clean, still impossible. He didn't touch it. He walked away, back to the church. That evening, the vicar collapsed in the confessional. He had tried to light a candle and found that all the wicks had been soaked in water. He said he saw something move behind the altar. He said it whispered his name. But the worst thing, the thing that turned Father Brown's blood to ice, was what he pulled from his coat. A verse, a single scrap, torn from a Bible not his. Leviticus 5:1, the one about silence, about witnessing sin and refusing to speak. Father Brown said nothing. He took the scrap, and as he did, a bead of blood welled up from the paper and slipped onto his thumb. He felt no pain, but the paper was still warm. The next morning, the villagers arrived to find the church sealed. A note on the door, in Father Brown's own hand. There will be no service until truth returns to the altar. No one knew what it meant. No one dared to ask. That night, 3 people swore they saw a figure walking inside the church, though no lights were on. Some said it was the vicar. Others said it was Eleanor. But one, the blacksmith's wife, insisted it was Father Brown himself. Only, it couldn't be. He had been in bed, with a fever, burning, delirious, muttering one phrase over and over again. The blood wasn't meant to stain the words. It was meant to silence them. He recovered days later, but never spoke of it again. And when asked what he thought happened to the Bible, to the words, to the blood. He only said, the verse was rewritten, but not by God and not by man. Then he closed his eyes and never read from that Bible again. Chapter 5. A confession nobody ever heard. He entered the confessional and locked the door from the inside. Yet when they opened it 5 minutes later, he was gone, and only the smell of ash remained. It was Thursday evening, when the last villager saw Harold Finch alive. A quiet man, a schoolteacher with stooped shoulders and a crooked tie, known more for his silence than his sins. He had walked into St. Hecate's just before sunset, past the empty pews, straight to the confessional, as if the walls themselves had called him. The priest on duty, Father Matthews, waited on the other side. He heard the door close, heard the lock turn, then silence. Not the kind of silence that follows prayer, the kind that follows vanishing. Father Matthews waited. A minute passed, then 2, then 6. Still nothing. No words, no breathing. He knocked once. No answer. He stepped outside, rounded the booth, and called his name. No sound. When he unlocked the door, the booth was empty. No sign of Harold Finch, no coat, no shoes, no footprint, no breeze, just the lingering, curling scent of something burnt. But nothing was scorched. The wood was cool, the air was heavy, and in the place where a man should have been sat a folded note. No handwriting, no name, just 5 words typed cleanly on yellowed paper. I never meant to confess. That night, Father Brown was summoned not by the vicar, but by fear itself. By then, the church had developed a reputation. Doors that opened on their own. Candles that flickered only when no one watched. Dreams that echoed across multiple households, like a shared memory no one claimed to live through. But this was different. Harold Finch was a living man, known to everyone. And now he was unaccounted for, yet not missing in the traditional sense. His wallet remained in his home. His keys hung on their hook. His cat had been fed. His fireplace tended. But he never returned. Not a soul saw him leave. And no one could explain how a man disappeared from a sealed box of solid oak without unlocking the door or passing by a single witness. Father Brown sat in the confessional that same night. He sat there for hours, listening, not for footsteps, not for voices, but for guilt. He believed it could linger, like smoke after a candle snuffed out. And in that space, between the grain of the wood and the velvet curtain, something did linger. Not guilt. Something worse. Regret. Not his own, but someone else's. He closed his eyes and pressed his fingers against the tiny grill where penitent and priest were separated. And there, beneath the cold metal, he felt heat. Barely. But it was there. He did not speak. He waited. And then from the other side, something touched the grill. A finger. Cold. Dried. Delicate. He didn't flinch. Instead, he whispered, "What did you come to say?" There was no reply, but the warmth vanished, and the scent returned. Ash and lilies, a combination no one should associate with confession. The next morning, the police were called again. Not because of Harold, but because the confessional itself had changed. The velvet curtain now bore an imprint, a face, pressed from the inside, as if someone had screamed silently against it for years. The wood at the base was warped, burnt, but not by fire, more like aged by presence, a presence too constant, too intense for the structure to contain. And inside the booth, tucked behind the kneeling pad, was a second note. He didn't want to confess. He wanted to erase. Father Brown took it quietly. He knew better than to show panic. He returned to his room in the rectory and began reading through old school records. Harold Finch had taught literature for 27 years, but before that, for a single year, he taught at a correctional facility. The year was 1989. The only class he taught, juvenile inmates. One of them had hanged himself the day before Christmas. The file was thin. The name was redacted. But a handwritten line in the margin of the report stopped Father Brown's breath. Was seen entering chapel with Mr. Finch before final incident. He looked back at the note. I never meant to confess. He hadn't come to speak. He had come to be silenced. The next night, the church lights flickered. For the first time in recorded memory, the bells rang at midnight. No one pulled the rope. No one had access to the tower. And beneath the bell, left neatly in the center of the floor, was a school ID card. Harold Finch, only it was cracked down the middle. Father Brown studied it by candlelight. On the back, the ink had bled from moisture, but not water. Tears. The paper was damp, but only on the side with the words, faculty. That same night, 3 children in the village, none older than 10, reported waking up at the exact same moment. 3:07 a.m., each said they saw a man sitting at the foot of their bed. He did not move. He did not speak. He only held a piece of paper in one hand and placed a finger over his lips with the other. A librarian down the lane found an old copy of the Scarlet Letter misfiled in the church archives, tucked behind a psalter. Inside, a confession had been handwritten in red ink, though the name was never signed. A story of silence, of watching, of guilt long denied, finally accepted, then hidden again. When asked what it meant, Father Brown only said, "Some sins aren't buried. They kneel beside you, waiting for you to speak." But the confessional remained locked. No key could open it. No locksmith could explain why. And when they tried to break it open, the wood splintered in a strange way, like something was splintering outward, not inward, as if something inside wanted out. By the end of the week, the church began holding services outdoors. No one would enter, not even the vicar. And as for Father Brown, he sat beside the booth every night, a candle burning low, waiting for the door to open. It never did, but on the 7th night, the candle extinguished without wind. And in the final puff of smoke just before it vanished, he smelled the impossible. A boy's cologne, cheap, artificial, trapped in time. And then he heard the sound he feared most, the whisper of a breathless voice saying, "Forgive me. I said nothing." The booth was empty, but the guilt had finally spoken. Only not aloud, not to a priest, but to a place, and that place would never let it go. Father Brown stood, placed the candle back on the pulpit, and wrote a single line in the church's logbook. Confession was offered, but never heard, and he never opened that booth again. Chapter 6. The vicar's alibi didn't hold. The vicar said he was leading evening prayer, yet the church bell rang for a funeral that was never announced, and no one else was inside the chapel. It began with something far too ordinary, a ledger entry tucked into the back of St. Hecate's daily logbook, written in the vicar's own hand. Attended to choir rehearsal, 6 hours to 7 p.m., vestry. A casual note, harmless, until Father Brown noticed the time. It was the same hour the bell tolled 13 times, not 12, not 6, 13. And no choir had rehearsed that night. The church was empty, completely empty. And yet someone, or something, had pulled the bell rope with such force that the old wood snapped at the base. The bell had rung out over the village in a way it hadn't in decades, long and aching, like it was mourning something it had seen but couldn't forget. It echoed across rooftops and down cobblestone alleys, stopping clocks and conversation. Even the dogs whimpered. And when the townspeople arrived at the church doors, drawn by instinct, by dread, the pews were bare, the altar untouched, and the pulpit completely clean, except for one detail. In the center of the aisle, directly beneath the bell's shadow, someone had left a single white glove, the kind Eleanor used to wear, still damp, still warm. When asked, the vicar insisted he had been in the vestry, alone, reading scripture. But when the organist, Mrs. Hargreaves, returned the next morning to retrieve her sheet music, she found the vestry completely dark, untouched, dust undisturbed. No chair had been moved, no pages had been turned, and yet the vicar's Bible was found, open, not on the vestry desk, but laid across the third pew. Eleanor's pew, with a single line underlined in crimson ink, and what is whispered in secret shall be shouted from the rooftops. Father Brown did not confront him immediately. He waited, watching, letting the silence grow thick enough to trap a truth. Because the vicar's hands trembled when he passed the communion plate that Sunday. Because his collar was wrinkled, though he'd always been fastidious. Because when the name Eleanor was mentioned in a prayer, his voice cracked. Just once, but enough to make the candles shiver on their wicks. Father Brown followed him that evening, quiet as a shadow. The vicar didn't go home. He didn't go to the rectory. He went behind the church to the old gardener's shed, abandoned since the last caretaker disappeared in 1963. Inside, beneath the cracked stone floor, Father Brown watched him lift a trapdoor and descend. He didn't follow, not then. He waited until the vicar emerged, nearly an hour later, pale, shaking, smelling of dirt and something else, old paper and ash. The next morning, Father Brown returned to the shed alone. Beneath the trapdoor, he found a narrow corridor, rough-hewn, unnatural, lit by candlelight that somehow hadn't burned down. At the end of it was a room no one remembered, no one had ever spoken of. Inside, the walls were lined with prayer books, dozens, all marked on the same passage, and in the center was a chair, and on the chair, Eleanor's rosary, still looped, still damp with oil. But the most terrifying detail, the seat was warm. When Father Brown emerged, he found the vicar standing behind him. No words were exchanged, but the vicar wept, not like a man caught, like a man released. He whispered, "I tried to keep it buried. I tried." Father Brown asked only one question. What was she going to say before she vanished? The vicar did not answer. He only handed him a folded note. It was written on the church's funeral bulletin paper. No name, no date, just a sentence. "If I speak, the church will not survive it." Later, when the townspeople questioned why the bells had tolled 13 times, Father Brown simply replied, "Because truth came to pray and found the doors locked." And the vicar's alibi, it didn't hold. Not because he lied, but because whatever was in the vestry that night wasn't him and may never have been. Chapter 7. The door was locked inside. The police broke down the door to rescue the missing girl, but once inside, they found the key had already been turned from within, and no one was there to do it. It was supposed to be routine. A missing persons report, a few questions, and the hope of finding her somewhere safe. Emily Doran, 17 years old, had been last seen walking into the side chapel of St. Hecate's 2 nights prior. The chapel was always unlocked during the day, a quiet space for private prayer, untouched by the larger congregation. She'd gone in during Vespers, carrying her sketchbook, wearing her mother's scarf, She didn't come out. When they searched the church that night, the door to the side chapel wouldn't open. Not jammed, locked. From the inside. There was no keyhole on the exterior, no bolt. No way in, unless someone on the inside turned the lock. They knocked. No answer. They called her name. Silence. So they broke it down. And when the heavy wooden door finally splintered open, they found the chapel completely empty. No footprints, no broken glass, no open windows. And yet, the key had been turned from the inside. On the altar stood a single item, Emily's scarf, folded neatly, placed in the center of a page from a hymn book. The page had been torn out. Hymn number 213. A melody no one had sung in decades, long ago retired due to unsettling associations from the old parish records. Father Brown arrived before the sun rose. He examined the room quietly, noting things the others had missed. The dust pattern near the kneeler had been disturbed, but not as if someone knelt. More like something had been dragged away. A faint scuff led to the back wall, where the stone was oddly cold, even colder than the morning air. He asked to see the torn hymn page. He read the lyrics silently. Then, out loud, the notes described a door that opens only when the heart breaks. A line read, "The child must knock from inside, though she never walked in." That's when the search widened. The townspeople combed the forest, the alleyways, the school grounds, but there were no sightings, no evidence of a girl on the run, no vehicles missing, no clothing gone from her room. Her sketchbook was never found. But then something happened that froze the village. The next evening, during the final hymn, the door to the side chapel slammed shut by itself and locked. While the vicar read the benediction, every candle in the church extinguished at once. No breeze, no draught, just darkness. When they relit them, someone had placed the hymn book back on the pulpit. Hymn 213, folded precisely. That night, Father Brown returned alone. He waited in the main chapel, just outside the door that had locked from within. And after midnight, he heard it. A knock. From the inside. 3 soft raps. Then silence. He didn't open it. He whispered instead, "Emily." No reply. Only a soft scraping sound. Then a whisper. Barely audible. "I didn't lock it. I waited." But the door shut when she smiled. He froze. "Who smiled, Emily?" The voice did not answer. Instead, the door unlocked itself. He stepped inside. Still empty. But now on the altar were 5 drawings from Emily's sketchbook. Detailed, inked in precise black lines. One of the church, as seen from above. One of the vestry. One of the confessional booth. One of a door that didn't exist in the church. Not visibly. A door with no handle, just markings around the edge, like scratches from fingernails. And the last sketch, a girl. Not Emily. Someone older, wearing robes that belonged to no known century. Her face was smiling, but her eyes were completely blacked out. He took the sketches, but when he turned around, the door was shut again and locked. It took the vicar 30 minutes to find the key. When Father Brown stepped out, the drawings were gone. Only the 5th sketch remained, tucked in his coat. He didn't put it there. The next morning, a custodian, sweeping the back crypt, discovered that one of the stone panels had cracked. Behind it, a hollow space. Inside, they found a single small skeleton, unidentified, buried centuries ago. But in the crook of its arm was something newer, fleshless fingers still curled around a pencil. And scratched on the wall behind it, in faint red ink, were the words, "The door was always open, but not for leaving." No one could explain how a locked door kept letting people in, or who it was locking out, or who had turned the key that night. Father Brown never gave an answer. But when asked what happened to Emily, he simply said, "She found a door no one remembered building." And when the church bells rang that evening, they only tolled once, but the sound echoed for hours, as if someone was still knocking from the inside. Chapter 8. One pew had no dust. They found the missing girl's shoes beneath the only pew in the chapel that hadn't gathered a single speck of dust in 30 years. The church of St. Hecate had been closed for renovation for over 2 months. Scaffolding lined the nave, paint tins rested beneath stained glass windows, and tarps hung like forgotten ghosts. Everything was layered in dust, pale, grey, untouched by breath or movement. Everything except one pew. Row 5, right aisle, closest to the pillar with the chipped stone cherub. While every other surface bore the fingerprints of time, this bench was clean, spotless, polished even, like someone had sat there, recently, repeatedly. Father Brown noticed it on his third walkthrough. He had been asked to bless the site before construction resumed. The new bishop claimed it was superstition, but the workers wouldn't come back. Not after the whispers. Not after the disappearance. 16-year-old Eliza Moore had entered the church late one evening, slipping past the gate after sunset. A friend said she wanted to sketch the altar for a school project. Her phone last pinged at 7:44 p.m., GPS placing her directly inside the chapel. But by morning, the only thing left behind was her scarf caught in the gate and a faint scent of lavender oil. The door had remained locked, no sign of forced entry, no prints, no exit, and no Eliza. The police swept the premises. Dogs sniffed every corner. Cadaver teams drilled beneath the floor. Nothing. It was as if the chapel had swallowed her. But now, standing alone in the chill of the dusty nave, Father Brown stared at the one pew that refused to accept time and saw the shoes, black leather, worn at the toes, small, delicate, tucked neatly under the bench. The same pair Eliza wore in the last photo her mother shared with the press. He reached down to lift them. The floor beneath them. No dust, not even a layer of moisture, just bare stone, clean, as though the space had been protected or preserved. He sat in the pew. It was warm, not residual heat, something deeper, like the warmth of breath, of watching. He looked straight ahead. The altar stared back, but just behind it, where the old stone wall met the floor, a sliver of light flickered, thin and unnatural, a glow, faint as a dream, seeping out from what should have been a solid wall. He stood, walked toward it. With each step, the warmth faded. With each step, the air thickened, and when he reached the source, he pressed his hand to the stone. It was vibrating, faintly, like a heart behind a ribcage. He pressed harder and heard it, a whisper, just one word. Still, he recoiled, stared at the wall, then back to the pew. The dust around it had begun to shift, gently, slowly, as if breath was rising from beneath the stone. That evening, he returned with the old parish ledger. He searched for records of that pew, who donated it, who sat there, who might have touched it last. But there were none. Rows 1 through 4 were labeled. Rows 6 through 12 too. But 5, no mention. It was as though that pew had never officially existed, and yet it had always been there. The next morning, the vicar arrived with news. A letter had been slipped under the rectory door. No return address, just a folded note. Inside, a crude drawing of the chapel pews, and one sentence, written in block capitals, "Don't sit where she wakes." Father Brown placed the letter on his desk, then returned to the church. The pew was still clean, still warm, But something had changed. A Bible, unopened for decades, now lay open on the seat. To Job. Chapter 3. The verse underlined in faded ink. Why did I not perish at birth, and die as I came from the womb? He closed the book, turned, and there she was. Not Eliza, but the girl from the sketch, the one Emily had drawn before she vanished. Standing at the back of the church, pale dress, bare feet, eyes hollow, smiling. He blinked. She was gone, but the pew was no longer clean. Now it was soaked in something dark. Not blood, not paint, ink, pouring from the open Bible like a wound, smeared across the bench, across the floor, across the shoes. That night, he burned the Bible. But the ink remained. By morning, the pew was clean again. The dust reset. Eliza was never found. But once a week, on the same day, the same time, Father Brown would find something beneath that pew, a single object, a lock of hair, a sketchbook page, a school ID, once, a tooth. Every time, no prints. Every time, warm to the touch, and always, no dust. When asked by the bishop if he believed the church was cursed, Father Brown only said, "No, but something remembers, and it remembers where she sat." No one sits in that pew anymore, but some nights, if you watch closely, you'll see the dust rise, as if someone just stood up. Chapter 9. He lied about the hymn. The last time they heard the hymn, it wasn't coming from the organ, it was coming from underneath the church floor, and the man who swore he played it was already dead. It started with a service no one remembered scheduling. The bells rang out at an odd hour, 4:06 a.m., and echoed down the empty streets like a call meant only for those too afraid to answer. No one had been inside the church. No one had touched the ropes, yet half the village swore. They woke to the sound of singing. Not choir singing, just one voice, distant, weary, male, singing the recessional hymn, number 1 to 18. Lead Us Gently into Night. A hymn removed from the hymnal years ago after the incident. By dawn, the organist's cottage was dark, the curtains drawn, the chimney cold. Mr. Percival Dunn, 73, who had played that hymn every Sunday for nearly 3 decades, was found in his armchair, head slumped, hands folded, mouth slightly open, like he had been mid-verse when death claimed him, except his mouth was full of dust, not just on the lips, packed inside. Dry, grey dust packed so tightly into his throat that the coroner couldn't explain how he hadn't suffocated hours earlier. There were no signs of a break-in, no struggle, just dust. And beside him, a torn sheet of music. Hymn 118, but rewritten. The final lines had changed. What once read, "Guide us through the shadows bright," now read, "Bring them down where candles die." No one could say who altered it. Father Brown arrived before the body was moved. He touched nothing. He looked once at the body, once at the torn music sheet, and then out the window toward the church. He asked a single question. "Who lit the candles last night?" The vicar answered too quickly. There were no candles. The church was locked. But Father Brown already knew he was lying, because the wax was still soft in the candle holders, because the scent of smoke clung to the altar linen, because something had been burned in the pulpit and not fully turned to ash. Later, behind the organ pipes, Father Brown found an old hymnal stuffed between 2 warped beams, covered in dust, sealed in wax. A bookmark still marked hymn 118. The original version, no changes, and next to it, folded into the spine, was a letter. Not from Percival, from someone else. The handwriting was delicate, almost childlike. "I only sing when called. I didn't choose the night. The hymn chooses the mouth." Father Brown read it 3 times. The words didn't feel like metaphor. They felt literal. He returned to the vicar and asked again, "Who requested hymn 118? The vicar insisted no one had, that it hadn't been sung in years, that it wasn't in rotation. But the church logbook told a different story. The night before Percival died, someone had written it in. Recessional hymn, 118. And next to it, initials, PD. Only the handwriting didn't match Percival's. It matched the vicar's. Confronted, the vicar confessed he had asked for the hymn, but not for the service, not for the congregation. He had requested it because of a dream. 3 nights in a row, he said, he had seen a girl, Eleanor, Emily, or someone else. He couldn't say. She stood beneath the organ pipes, her eyes blacked out, her mouth moving, but no sound coming out. She would point to the hymn book, then vanish. And on the 3rd night, he heard her. Just one word. Sing. That morning he added hymn 118 to the book and said nothing, because he didn't believe dreams could be dangerous. Father Brown told him, "Dreams are only dangerous when they aren't yours." That evening, as the sun dipped and the bells began their automated chime, the church filled with shadows faster than usual. And then music. No one touched the organ, no one moved. But hymn 118 played, soft, measured, too slow to be real. And then from somewhere deeper than the pipes, a voice joined it. Not Percival's, not the vicar's, something lower, ancient, speaking the final line not in English, but in something darker, a language no one understood, but all felt. When the song ended, the hymn book at the altar caught fire. No flame, no spark, just slow burning heat that reduced the page to black powder in moments, and then silence. And when they looked toward the pews, someone was sitting in Percival's usual seat. But it wasn't Percival. It wasn't anyone. Just the shape of someone. A figure made of dust, falling apart as the light rose. And on the bench beside it, a single sheet of music. Hymn 118, rewritten again. Now the final line said, "The one who lies about the song will sing it last, alone." Father Brown turned to the vicar, but he was already walking out of the church. He never returned, and hymn 118 was never sung again. But sometimes, if you walk past St. Hecate's just before dawn, you'll hear it, just one voice, still singing. Chapter 10. She screamed, but not loudly. They all heard the scream echo through the chapel rafters, yet when they checked the old audio tapes, her voice wasn't there, only silence and the sound of something breathing that shouldn't have been. The night before the choir's return concert, St. Hecate's Chapel had been empty for nearly a year. A storm had cracked one of the old beams, lightning had shattered the west-facing stained glass window, and services were moved elsewhere while repairs dragged on. But the choir insisted they return to the chapel for their first performance, a symbolic reawakening of the church's voice. 12 girls, all under the age of 20, rehearsing under candlelight in a building no longer warmed by electricity. The organ was off, the roof still creaked, the candles flickered like dying stars, and yet the song that came from their mouths was steady, pure, beautiful, until it happened. At precisely 7:06 p.m., just as the soloist, 14-year-old Clara Manning, opened her mouth for the final note, something shifted. The candles went out, every single one. The cold pressed in, and then came the sound. A scream. Sharp, female, human, but wrong. Because it didn't ripple through the room like a human voice would. It came from inside the walls, from beneath the floor, from the stones above, everywhere and nowhere. The choir scattered, chairs crashed, someone fainted, But when they turned on flashlights and searched the building, Clara was still there, pale, shivering, kneeling at the altar. Her mouth was open, but she wasn't making a sound. When they tried to speak to her, she covered her ears and shook her head. And when they brought her home, she wouldn't speak for days. She wrote only one sentence in her notebook. I screamed, but not loudly. That was the night Father Brown returned to the chapel. It was past midnight. The candles had long since melted into wax puddles, and the choir had refused to step back inside. But he went alone, quietly, carrying nothing but a lantern and a page from an old hymnal, one Clara had been singing when it happened. He entered through the side door, left the main lights off, and sat in the pew closest to the pulpit. He listened. The silence was dense, but not still. There was something alive in it, a pressure, a shape just outside understanding. And then very faintly, he heard the sound. Not a voice, not music, but breath, strained, croaking, as though someone was trying to scream again, but couldn't. He followed it. It led him to the sacristy. The back wall had been recently plastered, but unevenly. One corner was still soft. When he pressed it, his fingers met something hollow behind the wall. He tapped. It tapped back. 3 knocks, then silence, then a whisper. Not from behind the wall, but inside the chapel itself. She tried not to. He turned. The room was empty, but the candles relit, one by one, and on the altar stood a tape recorder, the same one the choir used to record rehearsals. Only it hadn't been there minutes before. He picked it up, rewound it, pressed play. There was static, then silence, then Clara's solo, clear, haunting, perfect, and then the scream, but only for a second. Then, nothing. The audio file continued, but the waveform flatlined, and just before the end of the recording, something whispered, barely audible, beneath the silence. She wasn't the first. Father Brown brought the tape to the rectory. He asked the choir director if the recorder had ever been used before. The answer? Yes, 10 years ago, by another girl, Eleanor Wentworth, the same Eleanor who vanished during service, the same Eleanor whose name kept circling the edges of every mystery that now clung to the church like ivy. He asked to see Eleanor's last rehearsal tape. It was gone, wiped, but one backup remained on a cassette, mislabeled, filed under organ repair notes. Father Brown played it and froze. The voice was identical. Clara's voice, singing the same hymn, hitting the same final note, interrupted at the same time, by the same scream. The dates didn't line up. The timing was impossible. But the audio was real. He layered both recordings. They matched, perfectly, down to the breath. That night, he returned to the chapel. He placed both recorders on the altar, lit a single candle, and played the tapes together. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the flame turned blue, and the scream returned, not recorded, alive, rising from beneath the floorboards, shaking the stained glass window like it would shatter again. And then, just behind him, he heard a girl whisper, "You heard it. Why didn't they?" He turned. The chapel was empty, but the candle was gone, and in its place, an old ribbon, red velvet, the kind worn by choir soloists decades ago, stitched into the seam, the initials EW. He picked it up. It was warm, still carrying a pulse. Clara eventually began to speak again, but only one sentence, always the same. She screamed, but not loudly. That's why they didn't believe her. Father Brown did. He always had. But belief came too late, because now the chapel sings without voices. And on stormy nights, if you press your ear to the stone floor just beneath the altar, you'll hear her, not Clara, the one before, screaming, but not loudly, just enough to remind you she's still down there, and she remembers who didn't listen. Chapter 11. Father Brown counted 8 footsteps. He was alone in the locked church when he heard footsteps walking toward him, clear, deliberate, echoing across the stone, and he counted 8 before realizing there should have only been 2. Father Brown had arrived earlier than usual that morning. The air outside was thick with mist, and the stones of St. Hecate's glistened as though the fog had swept through the walls. He unlocked the front doors himself, as he always did, with a single iron key that had belonged to 5 vicars before him. Inside, the chill had settled deeper than usual. The cold felt older than weather, like the remnants of a forgotten breath. The pews were still, the candles untouched, the altar silent. He took his usual seat in the 5th row, opened his notebook, and began reading through the schedule for the funeral of a man who died without ever attending a single service. But then the footsteps started, not hurried, not hesitant, just walking, heel, toe, echoing, purposeful, and he counted them 1, 2, 3. He turned his head slowly. 4, 5. There was no one there. 6, 7, 8. Then silence. He stood, heart steady. He had heard strange things in churches before, old wood creaks, drafty groans, but these were not structural echoes. These were footsteps, made by weight, made by someone. Only no one was there. He scanned the aisle. Stillness. He checked the doors. Still locked, bolted from the inside. He walked the perimeter. Nothing. And then he noticed something new. Just before the confessional, near the carved angel whose wing had chipped decades ago, a small trail of footprints in the dust. Bare feet, slightly damp, 8 distinct steps, but only going one way. Not coming in, not going out, just approaching him and stopping, right where he had sat. He looked down at the pew. It was still warm, and on the seat, barely visible, was a single fingernail, torn, jagged, and old. Too old to belong to anyone who should be walking. He took the nail to the sacristy, sealed it in an envelope, and placed it inside a drawer. But it didn't stay there. The next day, it was on the altar, beside a torn page from a funeral guest book, not signed by the deceased, signed by someone named Eleanor, in handwriting that hadn't been seen in over 2 decades. He took the page to the archives, compared the penmanship. It was exact, perfect, but impossible. Because Eleanor Wentworth's funeral had never happened. Because Eleanor had never been declared dead. Because the church had refused to perform a service without a body. Father Brown returned to the nave, stood in the exact center, closed his eyes, and then, from the far end of the church, the footsteps came again. 1, 2, 3, and again they stopped at 8. But this time a voice followed, soft, female. "I made it to you, but you weren't looking." He opened his eyes. Nothing. The room was as empty as before, but something in the air had shifted. It felt occupied, heavy, watched. He turned toward the 5th pew, where he always sat, where she had stopped, and there, beneath the bench, etched into the wood in tiny scratch marks, was a question. "Why did you stop counting?" He didn't respond. He walked outside, took the long way around the church, sat in the cemetery, let the silence press in. That night, he reviewed the security tapes. No one appeared, but the sound of footsteps recorded clearly. 8, every time. He layered the audio with historical recordings and discovered something that didn't make sense. The pattern of the footsteps, the speed, the pace, the length, was identical to a recording made in 1987. The last known service Eleanor attended, the one she never returned from. He played both tracks side by side. They matched, down to the dust. He replayed it again and again, listening not just to the steps, but to the pause between them. Because there was a pause after step 4, as if the walker had turned their head, as if they had noticed someone watching, as if they'd seen him. The next morning, the footprints were gone, but in their place, in the exact same pattern, lay 8 drops of water. Clean, unmixed with dust, fresh. The janitor hadn't been in. No leaks from the ceiling, just water. And under the final drop, a faint imprint of a hand, palm down, as if pressing into the stone, as if steadying herself before fading away again. He returned to the pew, lifted the cushion, and there, where it met the wood, was a small scrap of fabric, black silk, from a choir robe, dated, faded, and clutched in its folds. Another fingernail, smaller, older, matching the first. Father Brown placed them together and finally whispered, "I never stopped counting. I just thought you'd never come all the way." The lights flickered once, then silence. For the next week the church was quiet, until Sunday, when the new girl, 13-year-old Miriam, took her seat in the 5th row by mistake and rose again, pale and trembling. When asked what was wrong, she said, "Someone was already sitting there." She touched my hand, but she didn't look up. Father Brown didn't ask anything further. He only closed the pew, hung a velvet rope, and wrote a single line in his logbook. She made it to 8. Chapter 12. The widow wore her voice. They buried her without a tongue, but when the church bell rang the next morning, the widow's voice was the one they all heard singing. Everyone in the village had seen her once. Mrs. Amara Bexley. Black veil, black gloves, black heart. That's what they said. Her husband, Charles Bexley, had died in his sleep. At least that was the story, and she hadn't shed a single tear at the funeral. Instead, she'd stood at the edge of the grave, silent, lips closed, face expressionless, as if she'd already buried him years ago. And when the choir began, the final hymn, she turned her back to them all and walked away. She never entered St. Hecate's again, until the night she died. They found her body on the chapel floor, arms folded, legs tucked politely to one side, as if she'd laid herself down in reverence. No signs of struggle, no sign of forced entry. But her tongue was missing, surgically removed, not torn, not mutilated, gone, clean, precise, and deliberate. The coroner said she had bled out quietly, mouth closed, as though she didn't resist, as though she expected it. But the next morning, as the first light bled through the colored glass of St. Hecate's, the bell rang. Not the usual chime, not the stiff, metallic clang the old bell made when pulled by rope. This was a voice, a woman's voice, singing, perfectly clear, perfectly calm, and horribly familiar. Father Brown heard it from the rectory. He was already awake, already dressed. Something had pulled him from sleep minutes before. The sensation of being spoken to, but without words. He stepped outside, followed the voice, followed the bell. The sound came not from the tower, but from inside the chapel itself. He opened the doors. No one there. The altar was untouched, the pews undisturbed, except for one thing, a long black veil draped over the lectern. Still warm, still damp with the scent of lavender oil. He stepped closer, and the singing stopped. Mid-verse, a breath suspended, then silence, as though someone had vanished mid-syllable. He picked up the veil. Beneath it was a folded sheet of music, not from the hymnal, handwritten, old, cracked at the edges. A solo marked only by the title, the widow's benediction, and at the bottom, a name, not Amara's, but Anne Bexley, her husband's first wife, dead 40 years, declared drowned, but never found. He took the music back to the rectory, compared it with the church archives. The handwriting matched Anne's diary, which had been sealed and stored after her disappearance. Only one thing didn't match: the dates. The sheet of music was dated the day after she was presumed dead, as if she had written it posthumously. That night, Father Brown returned to the chapel. The veil had returned to the lectern, and so had the voice. Only this time, it was not singing, it was whispering, over and over. She wore what I never could. He turned toward the sound, and saw her, Amara, not as she was, but as she had been on her wedding day, young, radiant, veiled in black, mourning before she'd even married. She raised a hand toward him, her mouth opened, no tongue, but the voice was still hers. "You buried the wrong one." He stepped back, and the air grew cold. He dropped the sheet of music, and in its place, beneath the veil, was a second item, a wedding ring, old, worn, inscribed inside, "To my first, the only one." Initials, A.B. But it wasn't Charles's handwriting. It matched Anne's. He realized then, Amara hadn't married Charles. Not truly. She'd taken his voice, his name, and buried the woman he loved in silence. And now, the chapel was singing her back. The next morning, the veil was gone, but the altar cloth had changed. Embroidered into its seam, barely visible in the light, was a line of musical notation. Father Brown played it on the old organ. The tune that came forth was not a hymn. It was the same melody from the funeral morning, the same voice, soft, clear, and stitched with grief so deep it turned the breath to ice. The widowed voice was still inside the walls, still rising, still singing, still buried, and she would not rest. Not until the final line of her song was heard, and the name they forgot was remembered. When asked about it later, Father Brown only said, "She didn't lose her voice, she gave it away, but now it's wearing her." And for the rest of his life, he never walked past the chapel alone at night, because the bell never stopped ringing, and the song never ended.